Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Mishpachah. Mishpachah is a Hebrew word for family. I'm Debbie Good, your hostess, and we're going to be doing some things that you might be able to share with your own family in your own home, in your own kitchen, your own dining room table, maybe even something with your own children. But first, before we get started on some things we can do at home, let's take an imaginary trip. If you can think back, now that we've been discovering Jewish roots, we've been talking about the principles of the dietary laws, the festivals that are outlined for us in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, things that seem a little bit different than, say, the customs of your friends. There might be some customs that you've given up, perhaps some customs that you are trying to adapt into your lifestyle now. There are times when we seem to be a little bit outcast. We seem to be a little bit different. And if you remember scripturally, we are to come out of the idolatrous nations also. Well, think back. There was another group of people that faced the same type of controversy in their lives. They were different. They liked some of the things going on in their world, but they didn't like a lot of others. They wanted to get really, truly back to the Word of God as they saw it, as they interpreted the Word of God. They didn't like a single man, whether it be a pope or a king, making religious decisions for them. They were different, and therefore they were outcast. Some people called them separatists because they wanted to separate away from the established churches. There was a group of people in the early 1600s who, finding it difficult to live at home in their native England, went to Holland and stayed there for several years, but still they felt that the culture there was too damaging for their children. They felt that their children were associating with things that they felt were not really right for them scripturally. The end result is that they sailed for a new land, a new place, where they thought they could begin to build and establish their own roots and to come up with certain principles where they could establish their faith as they had tried to live it before. Of course, I'm talking about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrim Society that landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 was met with an incredibly harsh year. The first year, half the people died. The winter alone was devastating to them. They didn't know anything about the produce of the land that they were now living. They had, for example, no experience with planting corn. And it was with the help of the native people of this place who helped them to plant the corn seed and showed them how to round off a mound so that it would grow. This helped them to have a harvest. In thanksgiving for this particular harvest, and in thanksgiving of the ones who had survived the devastating winter, they held a big meal, gathered together, and of course we've come to know this as our Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims were a type of separatist, but they believed in certain things that I found just really unusual, very, very interesting. For example, they did not like any of the Christian holidays. They felt that these were pagan in their nature. They were superfluous. And, for example, Christmas and Easter, they paid no attention to those. Now, they were very strict in their Sabbath observance. And, of course, I would disagree with them here. They believed that the Sabbath was on Sunday instead of Saturday. But the point being, not necessarily which day, but the point was they believed in honoring it and keeping it. And also, the only other festivals they celebrated was a type of fasting, in being humble before God, and a type of rejoicing or thanksgiving. And that later on developed into our Thanksgiving festival as well. Some of the Puritans who had settled in early America felt that education was vital to their young people. And this was the reason Harvard University was built. The people that settled around in the Boston, Massachusetts area very highly regarded education and wanted to provide a free education for all of their youth. Interestingly enough, my husband has found out that for many years, until actually fairly recently, in any of the theological studies at Harvard University, Hebrew was a required course. As a matter of fact, until rather recently, Hebrew was actually considered to be more valuable than Greek, than the ancient Greek, in which Scripture, New Testament was written. I find that rather ironic now, when we have so many people who want to study the Greek, but they just don't see the Hebrew as having very much importance. Anyway, one of the things the early Americans, the first settlers that came to this country and later, adapting with the Native Americans here, one of the things that has come to my attention is that they very strictly adhered to biblical principles that were found even in the Old Testament. I realize, of course, that they were a type of replacement theology. For example, they saw themselves as the new Israel on many occasions. But they still embrace the teachings of the Old Testament, whereas today the combination between Christianity, replacement theology, and Old Testament really becomes much more graphically dispersed. Many people do not believe that the Old Testament has any value for them whatsoever. And we find, particularly with the Pilgrims, with the Puritans, and then later on with the Swiss settlers that came over, the Amish, that the Old Testament held quite a bit of value. I actually had an idea of doing a program like this several weeks before coming out here when my son David came home from school after reading The Scarlet Letter. And after viewing some of this literature and learning about Puritan society, and had to look at some Puritan sermons, all of a sudden these principles were being reminded to me of what I had to study in high school as well. These days, though, our times have changed so drastically over the past few weeks. I don't think our world is ever going to be the same again after the tragic circumstances that happened several weeks ago in New York City or in Washington, D.C. We surely live in a different time. And one of the things I've often felt is we're always so quick to point out differences in each other. But there should be a time when we should find our common ground, things we have in common, rather than pointing out the differences, rather than arguing, debating, condemning. There should be a time when we can embrace that which we have in common. And surely this is a time for all Americans to come together and realize that we all have many things in common. Even though our faith might be diverse, still we practice a lot of the same practices and we believe in the same God. So when thinking about this program, I was wondering, how can we bring a little bit of Thanksgiving into our lives, and yet keeping it among our Jewish roots and our dietary needs and observing the laws of kashrut. I was trying to think, what can we do that's a little bit different, a little bit out of the ordinary? And I realized that when you talk about American vegetables, there are two that stand out just tremendously over any of the others, and that would be corn and pumpkin. We don't know of either one of them. We think corn was at the first Thanksgiving. Pumpkin, we're pretty much not too sure about, and of course nobody knows if the big bird was there himself or not. But we're going to start with 3 different recipes that are incorporating corn and pumpkin. One is an original that I devised myself. The other are 2 recipes that I found out of actually a recipe for computer use. It's the Jewish computer cookbook. It's very, very interesting. Let's start with some pumpkin soup, some cream of pumpkin soup, because that will actually take the longest. What we start with is a little bit of butter, about a tablespoon of margarine in a pan, and heat that up, and we're going to add to that some chopped onion. So let's put this in, and let's see if we can get the heat going pretty well on this and start stirring around, because we will want to saute this to where it is cooked to the point of being translucent. Now what I'm going to do is just leave that on for a few minutes, and we're going to come start something else, but I'm going to check back from time to time and stir it. Let me turn the heat down just a little bit. Remember that onion is back there. And let's make a corn salad. Now don't forget the onion that goes with the pumpkin soup. Let's start with the corn salad. We take 1 can of yellow corn, and to that we're going to add 1 red onion that's all chopped up. So that adds a little bit of color to it. A bunch of scallions all chopped up. Let's see if I can use it. And let's see, we've got some cider vinegar, about 1/4 cup. There we go, just pouring that on. Of course, that's going to give it quite a pungent taste. Now, before we do anything else, I'm going to stir. First, let me stir these onions. There we go. Now, I'm just going to use a fork to help divide some of these onions. But stir the corn and the scallions and the red onion together. And basically, that vinegar is going to get in there. And you might want to stir this several times to break up those pieces of onion. A little bit of garlic powder. Just sprinkle on there. Basically, it's just according to your taste. So a little bit of garlic powder. And then here's the pièce de résistance. You add a squirt or two of Tabasco sauce. Really enough to taste. So I'm going to sprinkle on liberally because my husband likes some pepper. He likes hot food. So we're going to give him a little bit of a jolt, and I might even add a little bit more later on. Now, this is basically done, except that it has to marinate for 6 hours. This is the type of thing that's good to do the day before. But that vinegar will set into the vegetables, soften them, and give them a little bit of a pickled flavor that's quite nice. Oh, and you can smell that now. It's just wonderful. We might add a little bit more Tabasco sauce to that also. Now, let's get back to the onion. Yes, it's browning nice and translucent. And I'm going to turn down the heat quite a bit. We start adding in our other ingredients. Now, the soup will actually take quite a while to cook. So we need to be prepared for a long time. What I'm going to start with, we need about, I think about 32 ounces of pumpkin. But I'm going to start, before I put that in there, I'm going to put in 2 cups of vegetable stock, just so this won't stick to the pan and burn right away. So here we go, 2 cups of vegetable stock. And by the way, this particular vegetable stock was just a powdered kind that, we add water to. Yeah, we get that going very good. It's a dark color right now, but it will get a little bit lighter later on. Now let's get back to the pumpkin recipe. Okay, it's 24 ounces of cooked pumpkin, So we have an onion and a tablespoon of margarine, 2 cups of vegetable broth, and then we've got 24 ounces of cooked canned pumpkin. And we just add that in. It's a lot, isn't it? It's just, and a little bit messy. And once we get all of that in, we want to stir it and mix it up, because once we get all of our ingredients in, basically this is just going to be covered and it's just going to cook slowly until it becomes a mushy, creamy soup. There we go. Now let's stir and blend that together. And then we'll add some of our seasonings. Now remember, there's 2 cups of vegetable stock and 24 ounces of cooked pumpkin, okay, plus the onion. Okay, now what we're going to add, let's see, we've got 1/4 teaspoon of salt. That sounds like it's not very much. 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and then 1/8 teaspoon each of cinnamon and nutmeg. I've mixed these 2 together, so it's 1/8 teaspoon each of that, and then 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And again, we mix up real well. And then we'll add the most unusual ingredient, the whitener. The recipe calls for 2 cups of parve, or is it like a meatless or a dairyless type of whitener. Coffee whitener would be like non-dairy creamer. The only thing is most of these are not parve anymore. And also, most of those come in powdered form. You can actually use cream if you want. What I chose is a type of a mixture. Now this one just happens to be parve or pareve, meaning that there's no dairy, there's no meat or anything in it. But this is like a creamy mixture that you would use like coffee. This particular kind is mocha mix, but that does not mean that it's chocolate. It just means that it's a type of cream mix. And we will add this. That's 2 cups. And now it's beginning to take on that creamy texture. You know, you might want to check every once in a while. And you can add a little bit more of this mocha mix. Coffee Rich is another type another type of whitener that you can use. It's a little bit creamier. And I'm going to turn the heat down a little bit and cover. And that you will want to cook covered for 30 to 45 minutes. Quite a bit of time. But you want everything to mush down together. Okay, so that's 2 things we've done, a corn salad and a pumpkin soup. And by the way, we're not finished with the pumpkin soup. We're going to do something really neat to garnish that in just a little bit. Now let's come up with my own concoction. I did this at home because I wanted to do something different. If you'll remember several weeks ago, we had made a kugel. A kugel is a type of pudding, usually using starches. We've made a noodle kugel, a potato kugel, and I thought, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if we came up with a cornbread kugel? Believe it or not, I tried this at home and it was really quite good. I took a basic recipe from a challah or bread type kugel and just adapted it. So what I did is you take some cornbread, and it's really best if it's a little bit stale, a little bit dried out. And this is about half of a cornbread. So this is a nice way of using the leftovers, okay? And you have it in big chunks, but you might want to mash it down a little bit smaller. But it is kind of dried out, like I said, what you want, because we're going to add liquid to it first thing. Okay, just kind of get that crumbled up real good. A lot of people might prefer to take the crust. You know, when you make a challah kugel, a lot of times you take the crust off. But cornbread is so soft and really didn't bother me to have the crust in there. Okay, to that we are going to add 1 cup of apple juice. Could be orange juice. I prefer the apple because I feel like then I can add some sliced apples to it. And once we have that in, we're going to stir. And basically you just want to set that aside just long enough so the cornbread can absorb some of the apple juice and kind of break up some of your big pieces in there. Okay, so we set that aside. And while we're setting that aside, you take about 1/3 cup of raisins and put them in some hot water just so they can plump up a little bit. By the way, the water will not go into the kugel, just the raisins. But you just want to basically rehydrate them after, being dried out for so long. Okay, now going back to the cornbread mixture. It's got the apple juice in it, or orange juice. Like I said, I used apple juice. Stirring this up. We've got raisins sitting in water. Let's add the rest of our ingredients. So we take 4 eggs beaten. And of course, I just whipped these up, but there's 4 of them. This is what's going to bind it and cause it to stick together and give it that sort of a springy bread pudding type consistency. Okay, so 4 eggs. I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of oil. Okay, let's stick those in. This is also what kind of gives it that moist texture to it. Now you can add either a 1/2 cup of honey or 1 cup of sugar. At home I used honey because I feel like that makes it more moist. Here we'll go ahead and put in a cup of sugar. So either 1/2 cup of honey or a cup of sugar. And again, I just blend in. You remember, if you watched a few weeks ago we made a kugel, I would blend in each ingredient separately. Okay, 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. And that's going to give it that real rich flavor. 1/2 teaspoon of salt and 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. I've got this mixed in together. I've got salt on the bottom, so it's 1/2 of salt, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. Sprinkle that in. And it appears the only thing we have left are the actual raisins. Or you can put in a couple of chopped up or sliced apples. Now we had put apples before in a kugel. It made it quite nice. It was sliced up, but I kind of like them chopped up into a little bit more bite-sized pieces, just because I feel like that will evenly distribute it a little bit better. And I thought, why not do both? This time putting apples and the raisins. And really you have to think about this. Apples are something we associate with being eaten in the, early American tradition also. I mean, after all, we had Johnny Appleseed and one of our little legends. And it's hard to think, hot apple pie is one of America's staple items. And so something about apple and corn just seems to go together real well and complement each other. So we have this really not too nice looking, kind of soupy, icky looking mush mixed up together. But what you do is you take a loaf pan. I happen to bring mine from home so that you can see just how beat up my stuff is. And just realize, of course, that this does get quite a bit of use. But you want to liberally spray it with some cooking spray and pour it into about this size loafing tin. And then set it in the oven to bake at 350 degrees for about an hour. It's going to take quite a while for it to set. I would say at least an hour, probably more like an hour and 15 minutes. You just need to check it and make sure it springs back, but I would say at least a good hour. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside, but you remember the pumpkin soup we had started. Let's take a look at it and see how it's coming along. Oh, it's pretty. This is blending quite a bit. Now, it really needs a little bit more cooking time because we want everything to cook down to a nice cream. So I'm just going to leave that here. But let's do a little something extra for it. I had some pumpkin soup one time in Israel that was just lovely. It's the most wonderful thing I'd ever tasted. It wasn't just the soup itself, though. There was a condiment that was served as a garnish that was placed on top. It was just one of those pine nuts. So what I did is I got a few pine nuts. And first, let's just start with a small size pan with about a tablespoon of margarine. And let me get some heat turned on. Oh, wrong one. There we go. Let's get some heat turned up. And I'll show you the pine nuts. Pine nuts, you can usually find them in a jar. This is in a package. They usually are associated with Oriental cooking. A lot of Middle Eastern foods, a lot of Chinese. But, I grow pine trees in my yard, so I think it could be considered just about as American as probably apple pie. Anyway, let's start the margarine by melting that a little bit. And all we're going to do is toast the nuts slightly. Here, let me get this out of the way. And we'll just spread the margarine around a little bit. And just very, very gently start to add a few pine nuts so that they can absorb some of the margarine and be toasted. Now, as this starts going, we want to watch that. You don't want them to burn. But as this starts cooking, let's start serving up some of the foods we've talked about today. By the way, this is the finished product of the cornmeal kugel that we talked about. So let me get a plate out and we'll get a bowl ready. Now remember, the kugel takes it a little over an hour to bake, but let's put a piece of kugel here and we'll dish up a little bit of our corn salad, which, by the way, this should have marinated, again, 6 hours. It takes a little bit of time, but we'll still dish a little bit out. And once we get that done, we'll have a little bit of pumpkin soup, which, again, because we've talked about it so much, it really needs several more minutes to cook. And I'm just going to dish a little bit of the pumpkin soup out in the bowl. I really need a smaller bowl for this to look a little bit nicer, prettier. But we get this, and we want it to look a little bit nicer, so let's wipe off some of the mess I made. And basically on the top, we'll sprinkle a few pine nuts, which, by the way, are cooking. And by the way, once they are toasted just slightly, just for a few minutes, just a tiny bit of change in color, just enough to really bring out their flavors, then you'll want to drain them on some paper towels. And voila, you bring that over, put a few of them just floating in the top of the soup, right in the middle. And there you have an all-American traditional type dinner with a kick with Jewish flair involving Jewish cuisine. We have the cornbread kugel, a corn salad, and pumpkin soup. You know, every time we do strange things like this, we're just involving all of these things into every aspect of our life. So let's keep cooking, because all of us belong in a big family, the family of God.